king of cool. He had this thing that he was a big rebel. And then when I saw the man, he was just so humbled and so nice.
There are people born to burn bright, fierce, and then vanish into darkness, fleeting as a firestorm, ripping through the night. Steve McQueen carved his name into every frame of cinematic legend. But behind that tough, cold shell was a soul that never truly healed. He pushed everyone away, wives, children, friends, as if afraid that if anyone got too close that they'd see his deepest fear, the terror of abandonment. And in the end, he died alone, without a single goodbye, in a crumbling clinic in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, solitary, defiant, and unwilling to let anyone in. His once proud mansion in Indiana stood deserted for decades, like an unmarked tomb. No one spoke of Steve McQueen anymore, and Hollywood had long since turned its back on its prodigal son. But then in 2025, an IFP investigative team ventured into that decaying home, and what they uncovered in the basement made the entire world fall silent. The objects buried beneath the floorboards revealed a heartbreaking truth that shattered the myth. It turned out, the strongest man on screen was perhaps the one who carried the most guilt in the shadows. If Steve McQueen's eyes once captivated millions on the silver screen, few ever knew that behind that cool, steely gaze was a child abandoned, his childhood stolen by the very people who were supposed to love and protect him. Steve was born on March 24, 1930, in Beech Grove, Indiana, during the Great Depression, when America was crumbling and hope itself felt like a luxury. His father, William McQueen, a reckless stunt pilot, disappeared without a word, just months after meeting his mother, Julia Ann. Julia was young, beautiful, and unstable, always running from the life she never wanted to live. At age 5, little Steve McQueen stood silently in a Missouri cornfield, watching as his mother knelt before his grandmother, clutching his shoulders like trying to hold on to the last trace of maternal instinct. "I can't raise him," she sobbed, her voice breaking under the weight of bitterness. The two women had once disowned each other. Julia had run away as a teen, carrying arrogance and an unformed heart. Now she returned alone and broken, abandoned by the man who'd left her pregnant without hesitation. Steve, just a baby then, could already feel the world turning its back on him. His grandmother took him in not with warmth, but with duty, that rough-hewn Midwestern love born more of endurance than tenderness. There, the small, skinny boy lived more in silence than in laughter. There were no lullabies, no warm embraces, only survival and a gaze that always seemed poised to flee. That quiet life didn't last long. At age 8, Steve's mother came back not with apologies, not with open arms, but like a cold wind after summer's warmth. She stood at the farmhouse door. Her voice hard, she wanted to take Steve back. No one asked what he wanted. In one afternoon, Steve left behind the cornfields and the cicadas for a gray, cramped house in Indianapolis, where his once idolized mother now lived with a strange man whose cloudy eyes and liquor-soaked voice haunted every room. At first, Steve tried to believe he had come home. But then came the nights, the moldy room peeling wallpaper, the TV's blare, tangled with the crash of glass and shattered arguments. McQueen couldn't sleep. He lay curled in the dark, holding his pillow breathless, listening to the footsteps of his stepfather dragging across the rotting floorboards, coming to smack him just because he existed. He learned if you pretend to sleep, you might escape a beating. If you stay silent, you might not get yelled at. And if you run fast enough, you might not get caught. But nothing was ever certain. Violence became routine, like stale bread, or the sound of his mother's labored breathing at dawn. Julia couldn't or wouldn't intervene. Once after a blow left blood on his lips, she turned away silently, wiping the table as if she didn't look, it didn't exist. Weeks later, Steve ran away. No goodbyes. Just a worn satchel, a few stolen coins, and a shattered sense of trust. He lived at bus stations behind dumpsters, under warehouse awnings. By day, he stole bread. By night, he shivered, trying to stay warm. That boy, dreamless, forgotten, learned to read people by their eyes and predict who would hit him, who might share a crust of bread, all while wandering those deserted roads alone. When Julia found him again, she shook her head and let go. She made a decision that terrified Steve. More than anything, she brought him to a reform school for troubled boys in Chino, California, signed the papers, turned around, and didn't look back. Steve walked through those iron gates without tears. He had none left. He just felt hollow, as if he had died long ago. But unlike what he expected, Chino wasn't hell. There were rules, schedules, work. No one beat him for simply existing. The wardens weren't kind, but they didn't lie. And for McQueen, that was the first time the world felt fair. He learned carpentry, the value of labor, and most importantly, he learned to trust his own hands, something no one before had ever told him were worth anything. When Steve left at 16, he wasn't a wild child anymore. He didn't become a good man, but he finally knew where he was headed. He walked into a military recruitment office and signed up for the U.S. Marine Corps, not to be a hero, not to escape, but because he understood if he didn't find a place with discipline, purpose, and control, he would drift again, sleep on sidewalks again, and be swallowed whole by the ghosts of his past. In the military, Steve McQueen remained a rebel, not a mythical hero, but a young man still haunted by a rugged, unhealed past. He once vanished without permission, AWOL, fleeing like he was running from a demon he couldn't name. But strangely enough, the very place that might have crushed him, the Marines began to carve away the sharpest, wildest edges of his soul. There he learned what no one had ever taught him before: discipline, responsibility, and endurance. Not from lectures, but from drills under the scorching sun, bone-chilling nights on the training grounds, and the eyes of his fellow soldiers without pity, without judgment. Steve served until 1950, leaving the military with an honorable discharge, the only distinction he ever received in life that didn't come at the cost of pain. He didn't talk about it much, but from that point on, Steve's path began to shift. Steve McQueen's life was tragically short-lived, as he passed away in 1980 from lung cancer. His net worth at the time of his death was estimated to be around $30 million, an impressive sum equivalent to nearly $100 million today. But over time, these values gradually faded in the endless current of Hollywood, a place where even legends can be forgotten. The grand houses, the money McQueen earned through his talent and passion, all of it was eventually sold by his son, as though a part of the past that couldn't be preserved. Only one small house remains in his hometown of Indiana, now a vacant shell, where memories of a legend have been forgotten, a faint trace in the collective memory. Hollywood had moved its child into the past, leaving behind an unfillable void, and only the winds that whisper through the old house still remember the name Steve McQueen. It seemed everything about McQueen had been forgotten until 2025, when the IFP Investigative Famous People team set out on a foggy February morning, driving through desolate country roads in Sarin, Indiana, gloomy, silent, and without a sign of life. The team was a small group of pop culture researchers, Hollywood historians, and an independent documentary filmmaker, all pursuing untold truths about the legend of Steve McQueen. They didn't expect to find anything monumental, just a rumored location, an old house mentioned in fragments from tabloids, and a few lines in diaries of McQueen's closest friends. But the house was unlike anything they had prepared themselves to face. Hidden behind ancient trees, the house looked swallowed by time. Wild vines crawled up crumbling walls, the wooden doors were rotted, and the shattered windows cast broken slants of light onto moss-covered tiles. No lock remained intact. They pushed the door open with their bare hands. It creaked like the sigh of a ghost that had slept too long. Inside was a frozen era. Furniture from the 1970s, dust so thick you could write your name on the tabletops. On an old wooden table, a tilted photo frame lay under a thick coat of dust. A picture of Niall Adams, Steve's first wife, smiling beside him at an old backstage party. That smile now was only a ghost. On the bookshelf, another photograph, Ali McGraw, the woman who bewitched the 1970s, resting her head on Steve's shoulder, in their wedding clothes in Cheyenne, Wyoming. She had once carried his child, but lost it. In that marriage, Steve didn't just lose a wife, he lost his last chance at fatherhood. Something that deep down, he may have longed for more than anything else. In the upstairs bedroom, beneath the dim light filtering through a torn curtain, they found another photograph, Barbara Minty, his last wife, with eyes so gentle it almost hurt to look at them. They had married only months before Steve died of cancer. The photo was face down on the table, as if it marked something that would never be finished. But after searching every nook and corner, the team realized something was off. It wasn't just the decay, it was the feeling of a place that had been removed from the world like a secret bunker. A place not meant to be lived in, but where Steve McQueen had hidden from the pain of the world. Then they found the room, a cracked wooden door, hidden behind a rotting staircase, and a passage choked with dead leaves. No nameplate, no sign, only a faint shaft of light, slicing down from a crack in the ceiling, sweeping quietly across a dust-laden floor. No one in the team dared speak as they pushed the door open. Only the hinges groaned, a cry from an old soul weeping in the dark. The room was stiflingly small with no windows. The air was thick with the smell of rotting wood rust and buried time. In the corner lay an old wooden trunk, silent, like the last relic of a pain never named. The lock was rusted, covered in cobwebs. One of the team members, trembling, pried it open with a crowbar just to understand how McQueen had really lived. The sound of metal snapping echoed through the space like breaking a decades-old vow of silence. And then they went still. Inside was no money, no stars memorabilia, but evidence raw, sorrowful, and haunting of a broken life. There were leather straps, handcuffs, slender whips, things that Steve McQueen had used not for acting, not for display, but for punishment. Some were torn, splintered, stained with old dried blood, caked with dust and age. No one needed to be an expert to recognize it. These objects had been truly used, and not just once. A thin, leather-bound notebook was hidden in the corner of the chest, its edges crumpled. Some pages torn, the remaining ones filled with frantic handwriting, as if scribbled during a panic attack or a sleepless night. No name, no date, just one line, bold and trembling like a tragic confession from a monster named Steve. I didn't think I would do it, but then I did. Just like him. Couldn't stop, couldn't hold it back. Him. No one needed to ask who that was. Steve's stepfather, the man who had beaten Steve and his mother Julia, leaving the boy with cries, bruises, and a silent vow that he would never become that man. But here in this room, among the leather straps and torn pages, the truth shattered through Steve had failed. No amount of fame could erase the darkness and rage inside him. One team member shakily closed the notebook. No one said a word. The cameraman lowered his gear, though the lens was still recording. There was no debate over whether to include this in the documentary, because they knew they had just unearthed not just a hidden corner of a star's life, but a tortured fragment of a man's soul, locked in a battle with his past and defeated. They left the room as twilight turned the sky purple. Wind rushed through the trees outside, swirling dead leaves and distant sounds like sighs from the past. The house was no longer just a place, it was a monument, a spiritual graveyard where McQueen had hidden the part of himself the world was never meant to see. The house was the deepest wound Steve McQueen never healed. While the world cheered him as the king of cool, the icon of rebellion and freedom, here between these cold walls and captive memories, a cruel truth revealed itself. Steve never escaped his stepfather's shadow. And in the end, perhaps Steve McQueen became the very man he spent his whole life trying not to be. This abandoned house exposes the truth, starkly different from Steve McQueen's career, which was full of stage lights, film sets, the roar of engines, and endless applause. Steve's life changed after he joined the Army, and with the support of the GI Bill, he enrolled in acting classes at Sanford Meisner's Neighborhood Playhouse and HB Studio in New York. During the day, he learned to use his gaze and breath to tell a story. At night, he raced motorcycles in Harley-Davidson and Triumph races to pay the rent. The Steve McQueen of that period was a dreamer, a man thirsty for life, living with his whole heart carrying within him a storm that never ceased. His career started slowly on the Broadway stage with small, inconspicuous roles in The Member of the Wedding and Peg of My Heart. But he was not born to be anyone's shadow. In 1955, he left New York heading towards the sun, California, where the heart of Hollywood beat with frantic rhythm. From small roles in Tales of Wells Fargo Trackdown to Wanted Dead or Alive, Steve gradually became the kind of face that directors couldn't ignore. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but there was something in his eyes that made people unable to look away, experience danger and truth. In 1959, Frank Sinatra cast Steve in a supporting role in Never So Few, and from then on, doors began to open. The Magnificent Seven in 1960 turned him into an icon. The Great Escape in 1963 put Steve McQueen on the global map, and he did it without a stunt double. The motorcycle leaping over the barbed wire wasn't just an action scene. It was a statement he wasn't pretending to be anyone else. He was himself, and the audience loved him for it. But even standing in the brightest lights of Hollywood, Steve never escaped the simmering wounds within. At night, when the theaters were silent and everyone else was asleep, he sat alone in his vast house, listening to the passing cars and remembering the nights of his childhood, spent sleeping on the sidewalk, gripping his worn-out shoes as though they were all he had in the world. The escape scenes in The Great Escape, the hiding in Papillon, or the cold vigilance in Bullet, these weren't performances, they were memories. Each role was a moment where he reopened old doors, confronting the monster that had chased him through his childhood abandonment abuse and the nameless loneliness. From Love with the Proper Stranger, Nevada Smith, to The Sand Pebbles, the film that earned him his only Oscar nomination, Steve McQueen became the new definition of Hollywood masculinity: fierce, solitary, unpredictable. The peak came in 1968 with Bullet and the legendary car chase through the hills of San Francisco. When The Thomas Crown Affair was released, Steve had become the man the whole world wanted to be. But no one knew behind those eyes was a man plagued by insomnia, waking up at 3 a.m. from a dream of his stepfather's footsteps or the cold face of his mother turning away. In the early 1970s, Steve was the highest-paid actor in the world, especially after the commercial success of The Getaway in 1972. But just when Hollywood was kneeling at his feet, Steve McQueen suddenly withdrew. In 1992, he turned down every script, every hefty paycheck, and disappeared into his own world. A world without directors, without stage, lights, only motorcycles dust, and the freedom he had fought his whole life to achieve. It was a strange decision to others, but very Steve, daring to let go when everyone else clung to it. It wasn't because he was tired of fame, but because he had never truly believed in it. For Steve McQueen, Hollywood was just a stopover. Pain, that was where Steve truly lived all these years. It wasn't until 1978 that Steve McQueen officially returned to the screen after a long absence. The film that marked his return was An Enemy of the People, a surprising choice compared to his usual action hero image. However, that was just the beginning of the end of his career. 2 years later, he appeared in the final two films of his life, Tom Horn, a nostalgic western, and The Hunter, where he played a modern bounty hunter. These roles not only ended McQueen's film career, but also cemented him as an irreplaceable cultural icon. Beyond his illustrious film career, Steve led a very different life in his marriages. Steve knew he was never a perfect husband. If he could go back, he wished he could fix the mistakes he had made, but the truth was, his marriages, instead of being filled with sweet and happy moments, became a series of endless tragedies, pains that never healed. Every time he looked back, Steve only saw repeated failures, deep wounds in his soul, and an emptiness that could never be filled. Each wife, each marriage was a painful reminder that he couldn't do anything perfectly, that he couldn't keep his promises, couldn't love and protect them as he had sworn. Nyla Adams remembers the early days when she loved Steve, the moments when their love shone like a soft, sweet melody. She can't forget the first look he gave her, eyes filled with hope and desire for a bright future, a life they would build together where love would guide them. "I will never let you suffer," Steve swore, and Nyla believed that every word he said would come true like an unchangeable truth. But then, like an unexpected storm, the light of fame extinguished all those sweet dreams. McQueen was no longer the man Neela once loved, no longer the tender husband who cared for her every day. She felt herself gradually becoming a shadow of the past, a faded image in her own life. Her husband, the one who once promised to be her solid support, was now lost in bad habits, alcohol, drugs, and endless affairs. When she discovered the unimaginable secrets, it wasn't a shock, but a pain so deep it pierced her heart, as if someone had stabbed her in the chest, a wound that could never be healed. Despite having 2 children, Terry and Chad Steve, the husband, the father, seemed to have vanished, and Nyla, carrying the burden alone, found herself in a pain that couldn't be shared. In the end, Nyla decided to leave, and Steve didn't try to stop her. Soon after, Steve met his second wife, Allie McGraw. Like his first marriage, they both thought they had found happiness in the dark. Allie came to Steve, believing that love would heal everything. But the days together quickly turned into a nightmare that could never be woken from. Steve, with his attractive and strong demeanor, made Allie feel like a princess, loved and cherished. But later, the long silent nights, the endless arguments, shattered her heart. "We loved each other in our own way," Allie later admitted, but that love, like Steve's endless affairs, was filled with pain, deceit and heartbreak. And even though Allie was pregnant, even though they once hoped a child could save everything, there was no miracle. Steve couldn't change. Sometimes, Steve's fits of rage didn't need a reason, just an unpleasing look, an ill-spoken word, or simply a day when he wasn't satisfied. Every time Allie was pushed into a corner, unable to fight back, unable to escape. The bruises on her body were a silent warning about the decay of this marriage. But the pain that hurt her more was the one in her heart, a pain that couldn't be put into words. She still vividly remembers the times he hit her in a frenzy when everything around her became blurry. Once, when she tried to express her feelings about Steve's affairs, he slapped her, as if trying to silence the lies she had just spoken. Another time, when Steve was drunk, his brutal punches knocked Nile to the floor, her body aching and tears falling uncontrollably. Each time, she could only lie still, feeling the pain spreading through her body, while her heart slowly broke, no longer recognizing the husband she once loved. And Allie, though loving him to madness, ultimately had to leave him to protect her own heart. Steve, though an inseparable part of her past, was also a wound that would never heal. It wasn't until Steve found Barbara that he truly had a home, a place to rest after all the storms. Their relationship started as a light love story, like a fresh breeze that blew into Steve's life, bringing hopes and dreams, even though Barbara only lived with him for the last 10 months before she passed away. In the brief months they spent together, their love seemed to heal deep wounds within him, wounds that past relationships could never mend. But despite having so little time, Barbara was the only one who could see Steve in a way no one else could. A man full of contradictions, both alluring and pitiable, strong, yet incredibly fragile. Steve and his partner, Barbara Minty, moved to the quiet town of Santa Paula, California, about a 2-hour drive from Los Angeles, to start a new chapter. They chose to buy a farm spanning over 15 acres, with breathtaking landscapes isolated from the hustle and bustle of life. Here, McQueen found not only peace, but also a chance to live true to himself, simple, private, and connected to nature. The house in Santa Paula was not just a place to live. It was a symbol of his new life. Beyond motorcycles and cars, McQueen was also an avid pilot. One of the reasons he chose Santa Paula was because it was close to an airport of the same name. There, he kept his beloved Stearman Model 75 biplane. When not acting or working on cars, McQueen could take off at any time, soaring through the sky as a way to find absolute freedom, something Hollywood could never give him. But despite undergoing a profound spiritual awakening in his final years after meeting Barbara, Steve McQueen could not escape the inner demons that had haunted him throughout his life. Steve continued to spiral into the depths of cannabis, cocaine, alcohol, and cigarettes. William Claxton, the photographer who closely followed him, shared that he smoked weed nearly every day. His recklessness reached a peak in 1972 when he was arrested for driving while drunk in Anchorage, Alaska. The tragic turning point in McQueen's life began in early 1978, when he started feeling unusual symptoms, persistent coughs that wouldn't go away, and discomfort in his chest that he couldn't explain. At first, he thought it was the effect of smoking and changes in the weather. So he tried quitting cigarettes and took antibiotics. But the pain kept intensifying, his breath grew heavier, and the fatigue kept weighing him down, a clear sign he couldn't ignore. McQueen, a man who had grown used to overcoming immense challenges in life, was now facing an insurmountable one. After finishing the film The Hunter, he decided to take his health seriously and get a medical checkup, no longer able to deny the truth. On December 22, 1979, after a biopsy, doctors delivered a devastating news. Steve McQueen had pleural mesothelioma, a rare and extremely aggressive form of lung cancer, often associated with long-term asbestos exposure. There was no effective treatment, no clear hope. By February 1980, the disease had metastasized throughout his body, leaving McQueen feeling as though he were trapped in a nightmare with no way to wake up. He tried to keep his illness a secret, but the truth couldn't be hidden forever. In March, when the news leaked out and hit the front page of National Enquirer with the headline, "McQueen has terminal cancer," the storms in his life seemed to have reached their peak. With traditional medicine no longer an option, McQueen, who had faced every difficulty in life, was now left with only one choice: gamble his life on alternative therapies. In July 1980, he left the United States and went to Rosarito Beach, Mexico, hoping to find salvation from a controversial method developed by Dr. William Donald Kelly. Kelly, a doctor rejected by the American medical community, had promised to heal when science failed. His therapy was a modified version of the Gerson therapy involving coffee enemas, live animal cell injections, massage, and the use of latril, a substance banned in the US. But this therapy offered only a faint hope, a small belief in miracles that Steve McQueen, a man accustomed to victory, was still willing to cling to, even though he knew he was facing a battle with no hope. During his 3-month stay in Mexico, Steve McQueen spent up to $40,000 per month, an enormous sum equivalent to $153,000. Today, searching for that faint hope. Those months were not moments of fierce fighting, but a tear-filled struggle against despair. His story quickly became a media focus with a mix of contempt and pity. People mocked him, seeing it as weakness from a legend who had always been strong, while others praised his relentless fighting spirit. But all the praise and attention couldn't soothe the constant pain in his body. Time was the enemy that never showed mercy, and for McQueen, it quickly became his greatest adversary. When he returned to the US in early October '80, his condition had worsened drastically. Tumors in his abdomen had grown aggressively, sending him into unbearable pain. Despite Dr. William Donald Kelly's bold claims in articles that Steve is recovering well, the reality was completely different. McQueen was no longer the strong and indomitable man who once faced every challenge. The body he had once used to conquer the screen was now succumbing to its own destruction. In a final attempt to prolong his life, McQueen decided to undergo surgery to remove the largest tumor. Doctors in the US warned that his heart was too weak and surgery could kill him instantly, but McQueen didn't listen. He decided to go ahead with it, for that was his nature, never to surrender, even knowing he was heading toward death. By the end of October, he secretly left the US and went to a small clinic in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, under the alias Samuel Shepard. The medical staff there had no idea they were caring for one of Hollywood's living legends. Before the surgery in the cold room of a clinic in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, Steve McQueen sat pensively, the dim light from a lamp casting shadows on his face, making his eyes appear even more teary. It had been a long time since he had felt this kind of weakness. Life had taught him to face every challenge with strength and resilience, but now standing before the waves of illness, he couldn't find that strength. A sense of hopelessness engulfed him, suffocating him, and he suddenly realized that he was no longer Steve McQueen, the strong one who could not be defeated. Tears fell like torrential rain, unstoppable. Thousands of memories rushed through his mind, golden moments, times when he raced cars at breakneck speeds, the roar of engines, as if he himself were part of every vehicle. Now all he could do was look toward the murky future, unsure whether he would ever get the chance to drive again. He cried for the first time in his life, feeling the weakness, the helplessness, this pain that was so overwhelming. Each tear felt like a sign of the end of dreams he had once believed were unreachable. His whole life had been lived for speed, to feel every degree of freedom that the car brought him, and yet now the truth hit him like a powerful punch to the face. Would he ever drive again? Could he overcome this illness? Like a defeated man, he knelt on the floor, his face filled with regret and pain. He whispered a solitary apology in the hospital room. "I have lived a life that was too rushed, too selfish. I don't know what else I could have done." His voice choked as though he had uttered these words 1,000 times in his mind. But now, facing the truth, all he could do was cry. Finally, the fateful moment arrived. On a grey, chilly morning, in a shabby clinic in Ciudad Juarez, nowhere near the dazzling lights, famous doctors, or the hum of modern machines of Beverly Hills. Just the peeling walls, dust-covered floors, and the smell of antiseptic mixed with fear. There Steve McQueen, the once invincible symbol of America, lay quietly on a hospital bed, preparing to face the final battle of his life. A battle he knew would not end in victory. The goal of the surgery was but a fragile miracle, to remove 2 massive tumors that were eating away at him every hour, every minute. These silent enemies had not only ravaged his lungs, but had also torn apart the fame, hope, and pride of a man who had once believed he was immortal. Steve was no longer the man with the iron gaze that once made Hollywood tremble. He no longer had his hair, his muscles, or the steel look that had struck fear into anyone who dared face him. Now all he had left was pale skin, hollow eyes, and the labored breath of someone nearing the edge of the abyss. And then the inevitable end came. Less than 12 hours after the surgery, at 3:45 a.m. on November 7, 1980, his heart, too tired, too broken, too exhausted, quietly stopped. No alarm bell, no emergency lights. No one screamed, "Save him." Steve McQueen passed away like a gust of wind, passing through the desert silent, painful, and incredibly alone. The man who once stood atop the peak of fame, the one who made the world turn its head every time he appeared, was now just a gaunt body lying motionless in a strange room, with no one by his side but solitude. The news of Steve McQueen's death spread quickly. Barbara Minty, his young wife, had arranged to fly to Mexico and collapsed beside Steve's cold body. She sobbed, her face buried in her hands, crying out in silence. "Why did you have to suffer alone like this, Steve? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you let me carry this burden with you?" His children, Chad and Terry, arrived when it was already too late, only able to embrace each other, crying like children who had just lost the last wall between them and the cruelty of life. After his passing, a simple but profound memorial service was held, led by Leonard DeWitt from the Ventura Mission Church, where McQueen had found peace in his final months. It wasn't a grand church or stage lights, but faith had comforted him when everything else in life started to fall apart. To honor McQueen's adventurous spirit, his ashes were scattered into the Pacific Ocean, a place where the waves carried a part of the legend away, yet kept it deep within the vast ocean. However, death was not the end of the Steve McQueen legend. On the contrary, it opened a new chapter for this immortal icon. In 2007, nearly 3 decades after his death, Forbes magazine ranked McQueen among the highest-earning deceased celebrities, a clear testament to his undying allure. That same year, he was inducted into the Western Artists Hall of Fame at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum, a well-deserved recognition for his bold roles in The Magnificent Seven, Tom Horn, and Nevada Smith. In 2010, on what would have been his 80th birthday, his hometown of Beech Grove, Indiana, where McQueen was born and left at an early age, dedicated a special collection of his life and work at the local public library, a quiet yet meaningful tribute to preserve his memory for future generations. In San Antonio, Texas, a street was named after Steve McQueen as a reminder of the man who made the whole world bow in admiration for his unmatchable coolness. Steve McQueen may have fallen to cancer, but he never surrendered. Not to the illness, not to fate, and certainly not to a world that had turned its back on him many times. His life was a symphony of rebellion and solitude, where each engine, roar, each drift on the highway was a declaration that he would live his own way, even if it meant sacrificing love, peace, or even life itself. McQueen didn't ask for permission to exist. He charged into life like a bullet, cold, precise, and never looking back. And that is what made him immortal. Today, people still call him the King of Cool. Not for the glamour, but because he embodied an unyielding spirit, an icon who never bowed down. Share this story not just to remember a legend, but to remind each other that some flames, though extinguished, still burn brightly enough to light up an entire generation. And don't forget